Hi, I'm Gareth, and in this video we're going to think about something called consecutives. This is something that troubles a lot of people when they're writing music, because we have a little piece of musical advice that you'll see in many a textbooks that says try not to write consecutive octaves or consecutive fifths. So let's just have a little think about what we mean by this. So consecutive fifths or consecutive octaves. Well, when we're talking about consecutive, what we're talking about is movement between one chord and the next chord, or even movement between chords sometimes, but it's kind of melodic movement between one place and the next. And it happens when we have two parts that both move in octaves. So for example, if I have a soprano part and an alto part that have got two Fs an octave apart, and the same pair of parts then go up to two Gs, well, that's considered to be consecutive octaves. Well, you might say, well, hang on a minute, I've often come across music where we're going in octaves. For example, Beethoven wrote a sonata in G that starts like this. Well, surely that's consecutive octaves. It's not considered to be consecutive there because it's a kind of feature of the musical texture. So in that case, you are taking a melodic line and you're reinforcing it at the octave. So you're doing something that's a particular kind of textural design. And you'll meet that a lot when you're writing for bigger ensembles like brass band or orchestra or wind band. You'll certainly see it in piano writing, where you also are sometimes like that Beethoven, just doubling up an octave. So I'm not talking about those kind of consecutive octaves. What I am talking about is when they occur in the harmony and the basic fabric of the music, and particularly when we're writing in four parts. When we're talking about consecutive fifths, it's important to say we're talking about perfect fifths. So if you have a perfect fifth followed by a diminished fifth, or an augmented fifth followed by a perfect fifth, actually that's deemed to be okay. But if you have a perfect fifth followed by a perfect fifth, and we've moved from one pair of notes to another pair of notes, then that's something that we're advised to try and stay away from. Okay, let's have a look at what I've got on the board and just have a little listen to this. It's not meant to be a kind of, wonderful piece of music particularly. It's just meant to be a chord progression. This is what this chord progression sounds like. Well, it's not terribly exciting, but it sort of sounds all right, doesn't it? All the chords seem to fit, and all those chords fit that melody at the top, so surely all is well. But this I've purposely written so it's got a good number of consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves in it. Now, if this is something you know about, you might just want to pause the video at this moment and see if you can spot the consecutive fifths and the consecutive octaves. If you're still unsure what I'm talking about here, don't worry, just keep watching and all will become clear. So whether you're still with me or whether you've come back to me having paused for a little search of your own, I'm now going to go through and show you where the consecutive fifths and the consecutive octaves occur in this particular piece. Okay, so the first pair of fifths that we're going to think about are here. All right, so there we have a consecutive fifth. So let's be clear why this is a consecutive fifth. We're talking about a perfect fifth between F and C. So F's in the bass, C is in the tenor part. So that's a perfect fifth. Then we move on to G and D in the same pair of parts. Okay, so that's a bit important, same pair of parts. So I've got a perfect fifth from F to C and a perfect fifth from G to D. And because of that movement, that consecutive movement from this chord to this chord, that's considered to be a consecutive fifth. So if it had been D flat, well, that wouldn't have been a consecutive fifth because it would have been a perfect fifth followed by a diminished fifth. But it's a perfect fifth followed by a perfect fifth. So does that sound really awful? Well, lots of people will say, I can't see the problem. What's wrong with that? It's perfectly reasonable as a progression. Arguably, it'd be better to try and avoid the consecutives, like to do something like this. So do you see what I've done there? I've just sort of thought, well, we could say have a G instead of the B flat there, and then we could have the B flat in the tenor. Do you see that would have been a way to solve the consecutive fifths? And it's generally considered to be better part writing to do something like that. Okay, well, I wonder if you could see where the next consecutives come. Well, if you look here, again, between the tenor and the bass part, here we've got consecutive octaves. So I've got two Cs and then I've got two Ds. So the two Cs are an octave apart, the two Ds are an octave apart. It's a consecutive movement from one place to the next. And so therefore those are consecutive octaves, and then the same pair of parts, tenor and bass, tenor and bass. So that's not such a great thing either. Doesn't sound bad. But would it be better if we didn't have the octaves? Well, yes, if it perhaps done something like this. So we then went to A in the tenor. Actually, that does sound a little bit better, doesn't it? So we could, for example, have solved that one by coming down to A in the tenor. It's funny how when you do these things, you end up writing consecutives, that often it kind of creates a secondary issue as well. And I'll tell you what I mean here. In this chord, the reason why that chord sounds a little bit thin is it's got three Ds in it. D in the bass, D in the tenor, D in the soprano. We've got F in the alto, so that's good. You normally want to have a third there, so if you're going to miss something out, miss the fifth out of the chord, so that's a D minor chord with no fifth in it. But it sounds a little bit sort of D heavy, and then this poor little F trying to get through on its own. As soon as I put the A in the tenor, that chord feels fuller. You've got the A that was previously missing, and we have only got two Ds now instead of three. So there's a kind of better balance in the chord. So you might think this is a bit of finessing really, more than a sort of fundamental issue, but it certainly helps. Just to think about avoiding the consecutives and see if it helps improve the overall impact. Okay, let's go on to the next bar, the next measure. I wonder if you can see here, we've got consecutive fifths between the tenor and the bass. D and A, perfect fifth. C and G, perfect fifth. So we've got consecutive fifths there. Sometimes you'll find that when you've got one set of consecutives in one place, you've also got another one in the same place. And that happens here because between the soprano and the tenor, you can also see that we've got consecutive octaves, two A's followed by two G's. So you see what's happening there. We've got fifths and octaves. Does it sound bad? Well, there are worse things, aren't there? But you can feel this, we've got this chord and then the whole lot just slides down one, which is not the best progression in the world, really. So trying to avoid that. As soon as you look at a bar like that, you can suspect that you've got consecutives. Why do I say that? Because every single part starts on a note and goes down a note. Every single part does that. Chances are, if they're all doing that, there's going to be some consecutive trouble in there somewhere. So there you've got consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. Now, how do you avoid these things? Because some people get completely tied in knots when they're writing a piece of harmony and they get sort of paralyzed. They can't write the next note because there's just another consecutive. Well, in a way, the best thing is to get writing and then go back and check it afterwards. But just to help while you're writing, see how much contramotion you can get between the top and the bottom part. So if you're harmonizing a melody, see how much the bass can kind of move in an opposite direction. So you see the top and the bottom sort of doing a bit of this. And if you're writing from a bass, well, the same is true if you're putting a melody on top of it. The minute you've got the top and the bottom moving in the same direction by the same interval, then be careful, because that's when you're most likely to have trouble. So here, even though we've got consecutives that I've purposely imposed, actually the top and the bottom going quite nicely in contramotion in the first two bars or first two measures. As soon as I get here, top and the bottom, same direction by the same distance, we're into a pile of trouble with consecutives. But as I say, don't be over troubled with it when you're writing, but come back and check. And the way to check is to be entirely systematic by checking each pair apart. So if I go through and check the soprano and the alto, That's a 6, so it's not a problem because we're looking for fifths and octaves, so you can move on quickly. That's a third, so that's okay. That's a 6, that's a 6, that's a third, that's a third, that's a 6. So I know I've got no consecutives in this piece between the soprano and the alto part. Now, let's check the soprano and the tenor part. Well, there's a compound fourth, there's an octave, so let's just check out that the next thing isn't an octave. Phew, it isn't, because that's a tenth. There's an octave. Oh, now then, what's happening here? Because we've got 2 Ds followed by 2 As. So this one you might easily miss, you see. So that D coming down to that A and that D coming down to that A is giving us a consecutive octave. Now you can see we've already fixed that by suggesting going to this A here, because that fixed the previous consecutive octave trouble we were having between the tenor and the bass. But by going to the A, you would also fix this set of octaves that are going on there. So you do see how solve it in one place, you solve it somewhere else. We've talked about the octave here between A and G, and then we go on to a compound third at the end, so that's okay. Check the soprano against the bass. Well, octave, or here's a fifth, so be careful. Oh, it's okay, it's going into a third. Or here's an octave, so be careful. That's okay, it's actually going into a fifth, but be careful about that. Now, we've then got this problem as well. So do you see, not only have we got octaves and fifths, but we've also got this set of fifths going on between the soprano and the bass. So it's absolutely packed with trouble, that bar, isn't it? So sometimes you spot them straight away, and sometimes when you check each pair of parts, you think, oh, there's another one. So that bar is a real pile of trouble. Going into the last note, not a problem, it's just a third. So you see what I've done? I started at the top and I've gone soprano against alto, soprano against tenor, soprano against bass. And we've found all the consecutives. Then, to be systematic, go back to the alto part and say, let's do the alto and the tenor part. Well, that's a 6, that's fine. That's a 6, that's okay. Oh, here's a fifth, but it's going on to a third, so that's okay. Here's a 6, here's a 6. Well, there's a fifth at the end, but there's nothing else to follow it. So the alto and the tenor part's looking pretty good. Okay, having done the alto and the tenor parts, look at the alto and the bass parts. Third, third, there's a fifth, but third, 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 fifth at the end. But it's just 1/5 at the end, so that's okay. So you can see what's going on. So I'm checking alto against tenor, then I'm checking alto against bass. And then I can go to the tenor part, the next part down, and check the tenor against the bass part. And I think we've taken care of this, really. We saw a fifth there, we saw an octave there, we saw fifths here. So we've got loads of them, haven't we, between the tenor and the bass. And then there's an octave at the end, but it's not next to another octave. So you see, if you do this logically, start with the soprano, soprano against alto, soprano against tenor, soprano against bass, go back to the next highest part, alto against tenor, alto against bass, go back to the next highest part, tenor against bass. Then you have considered every pair of parts. And that's how you will flush out where you've got consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves. Then you can set about repairing them. Sometimes changing the chord is the answer. Sometimes just changing the inversion of the chord will help you. But thinking about this bit of polarity between the top and the bottom in the first place would be good too. Sometimes you just need to reorganize the notes within the chord. So there are various ways in which you can fix it. But this is the issue, trying to spot your consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves and see if you can come up with an alternative that solves them, really, and then you won't get all this parallel movement going on. They are sometimes called parallel fifths and parallel octaves. So I hope that's useful as a little bit of technique in writing 4-part harmony, consecutive fifths and consecutive octaves.